we just wanted to use this time today to give a little bit more information on this really exciting bill, House Bill 1745, the Fostering Independence Through Education Act. And so thank you so much for being with us and being patient as we worked through our technical issues. So I just want to give a very quick overview of what we'll be discussing today. So we will start with a little discussion on the development and the need for the bill, go into some of the specific provisions of House Bill 1745, talk about the legislative process, and then really importantly, talk about the next steps and the opportunities for advocacy to really make sure this bill, which provides tuition and fee waivers and other supports for youth with experience in the foster care system, can become a reality. And so I want to take a quick second to introduce the two other presenters with me today. And first, Deborah Schilling-Wolf, the Executive Director of the Field Center for Children's Policy and Practice, and Jennifer Kempner, the Child Welfare Policy Director at the Juvenile Law Center. So the three of us will be having a conversation today on this bill, and throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box, but then we will also, I know we got a late start, but we'll also try to make time for at least a few questions at the end. So without further ado, Deborah, if you just want to give us a brief introduction into some of the background of the bill, when it was introduced, who introduced it, and what we hope this bill will address.
Okay, thank you so much, Nadia, and thank you to all of you who are participating today and interested in this very important topic. The Pennsylvania House has introduced a bill, House Bill, or HB 1745, also known as the Fostering Independence Through Education Act. It was introduced by Representative Dave Hinkernell, who represents both Dauphin and Lancaster counties. This is actually the third time this piece of legislation has been introduced. It's been refined a little more this time. And it came about initially when a colleague or a friend of Representative Hinkernell's was a foster parent and encouraged him to introduce legislation to provide for waivers of tuition and fees at state and state-related colleges for youth who were in the foster care system. It never went anywhere either session before. In the current session, Representative Hinkernell was actually appointed to be the majority chair of the Education Committee. And because of that, he decided that this was going to be the time when he would really advocate for passage of this bill and would have the opportunity, since he was chairing the committee, to be able to encourage its movement and potential passage. So we look at this as a really perfect opportunity to get legislation passed that will hopefully provide some assistance for young people who've experienced foster care in getting and succeeding in college. The current version of the bill was introduced on August 17th, 2017, and it's been sitting in the House Committee of Education until the most recent movement was yesterday, and we'll talk about that in a little while when an information hearing was held on the bill. So the bill this time around has a significant number of co-sponsors, more so than the last iteration. And if you look at the bill, you will see, they're listed alphabetically on the current slide, up through Zimmerman. And since the bill was printed, two more legislators have come on as co-sponsors of the bill, Representative Harris and Representative Toohill. And what this also tells us is there's an increasing interest in the bill, and there's also the opportunity for additional co-sponsors. So at the end of the webinar, when we talk about what you can do, keep in the back of your mind that if there's a state legislator who is not listed here, who you feel would be interested in being a co-sponsor of this legislation, and you have an opportunity to encourage them to do so, that would be on your list of potential advocacy activities. If you'll notice, actually, of the co-sponsors, most of them are Republicans. Representative Hinkernell is a Republican. There's a Republican majority in the House. And for legislation to get passed in Pennsylvania, typically it's the majority party is the one are best able to pass legislation. So it's very encouraging that there's such strong representation from that side of the aisle. So why is this bill important? This bill will really help fulfill the wishes and dreams of many young people in foster care, as well as provide them what research tells us is a better future. Research tells us that 70% of youth in foster care want to attend college. That's a really large number of young people. Yet they end up attending at less than half the rate of their peers. Those who do attend, most don't make it beyond their first year. The primary reason that young people report dropping out of college is financial. So directly, this bill will help address that issue. And a very small number of youth in foster care earn a college degree, significantly lower than the national completion rate, which is, close to between 3 and 10 times the rate of young people from foster care. So there are lots of barriers for young people from foster care, both applying to college, going, attending, and succeeding, ranging from poor preparation through in high school, not taking college courses, having no one introduce this as an option for them not seeing this as an option for themselves, frequent moves, which negatively impact their education and preparation. And, as many of us know from our own experiences and that of our children, the application process in itself is daunting and overwhelming. And, without an adult to walk you through the process, it really is an uphill battle and very difficult. So we know that young people do want to go to college. We also know that it's helpful for them, that there are connections between higher education and positive adult outcomes. Some of them address social issues. So, for example, every year of education decreases the likelihood they'll be involved in the criminal justice system or become victims of substance abuse. But we also know that it will help them in terms of their future financial success. It increases their potential for earning. It gives them better opportunities for jobs, and increasingly a college education or higher education and training is really important to be able to get the jobs that are out there and jobs that can provide you a solid future. And we know that it's reducing chances of unemployment and poverty and things associated with them, which would be homelessness. So it really is economically in their best interest. Higher education is also linked to positive health outcomes and, increased involvement in the community. So it's better for young people in many, many ways. And from a social responsibility perspective, young people who are in foster care have had a history of trauma. They've come into foster care because they've been maltreated, because they have a history in such they cannot remain with their own parents. So they come into care, they become the responsibility of the government, yet the government abandons them as they try to transition into adulthood. So we, as a society, really owe them as we would, our own children, because they are our children in a larger sense, the opportunity for success. So, some of the barriers that they face when they get to college are unique to kids in foster care. So there are a lot of financial barriers. They don't have anyone to help them look at different financial opportunities, apply for scholarships and loans. There are a lot of challenges and hoops, frankly, to jump through. They can be very frustrating and difficult to understand. Going through dealing with the bureaucracy is difficult for an adult with support and education. So with a young person typically on their own with minimal support, that's a hard thing to do. We've heard from young people who said, my financial aid didn't come in time, so I couldn't register for classes. So I just left. That's not an atypical story. So we know that the financial barriers are very difficult. We also know that to maintain standing in order to qualify for some financial aid or a lot of financial aid, young people have to be full-time students and maintain their grades in good standing. And because of their lack of financial support, that often they have to work full-time or they're going to school full-time. And that can become overwhelming and, again, cause young people to drop out and leave college. They don't have adults in their lives who can provide information, advise them, help them figure out how to register for classes. We heard one story of a young person who successfully applied and got into a college out of state, arrived only to discover that there was no housing for her because no one told her she needed to apply for housing. So those things that really would come second nature, be kind of intuitive for us, aren't necessarily intuitive for young people. And again, it's very difficult. They don't have the support, so when they're having a difficult or challenging time, there isn't someone there to walk them through and help them as they're, having that meltdown, help them as they're, as they're facing hurdles, and provide really an emotional and physical safety net for them. And then when they get to college, often holidays come around, the summer comes around, and they have no place to go where other students do. They may have no money for food. There's no one to support them. So there's so many different issues that they face. This bill and the provisions of the bill, which Jenny will get into next, really address a lot of those issues.
Great. Thank you so much. So, Jenny, what are some of the key provisions of the bill that will help ease some of the barriers that Deborah just identified, and who are the students that can qualify for this tuition waiver, and what are the schools that they can attend?
Great. Thanks, Nadia. And we want to remind the audience, you will get a copy of the PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint contains a lot of links to the information we're talking about. So you will definitely get that. And we also want to remind you to chat in questions so that we can answer them throughout or at the end of the presentation. So on this slide that you guys have in front of you, it outlines the sections of the bill, and we'll go through each of those right now. But the bill really does lay out these the definitions, and then tells us about each of the kind of benefits and provisions and what is contained in each of those. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this bill, which focuses on tuition and fee waiver, as well as developing points of contact and outreach and data requirements, which we'll talk about, cover the universities and institutions that are listed on this slide. So all the Pennsylvania community colleges, Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology, the schools that are designated as state-related by the Commonwealth, and those are listed, and then the schools within the state system of higher education. Next slide. And this slide shows you all the schools that are in the state higher system of education. So this bill does cover all of these schools. It does not cover every school in the Commonwealth or schools outside of Pennsylvania, but this does cover a good number of schools and opens up these opportunities for young people. Next slide. And so for those schools, what is it and who's eligible for these benefits and programs? And so eligible youth are defined in the current statute in a pretty broad fashion. And we have the provision excerpted on this slide, but basically young people between 16 and 23, that's when they would be utilizing the tuition waiver and having access to these other benefits. And currently as it's drafted, it would be young people who are in substitute care no less than 30 days, and then in the various situations that are listed below. Which detail ways that they could be involved in substitute care. And so you will see that it is pretty broad. The final legislation will likely be fine-tuned a bit, but we did want to share with you what's currently drafted in the existing version of House Bill 1745. In addition to the requirements related to your connection to and experience in substitute care, is just the requirement that you've graduated from high school or received an equivalent diploma, which could include a GED, that you've been accepted for admission to one of the eligible institutions, or you're attending. So it could be a young person who's already attending one of these schools, and if this bill is passed, would be able to take advantage. And then first, before the waiver kicks in at least, young people would have to apply for all the existing federal and state grants. So things like Pell, Chafee Grant, they would have to try to exhaust all of their available grants before the tuition waiver would kick in. Next slide. And then the next requirements or provisions of the bill that we're going to talk about will apply to all the schools, and so will be available for all young people within the category of eligibility. But this, I think, these are really excellent opportunities to make sure that the eligible youth are informed of the provisions. And so there are outreach requirements in the draft bill, and I'm sorry, in the bill. There are outreach requirements, and the first are related to the Department of Human Services, so the State Child Welfare Agency. And so requirements that the State Child Welfare Agency, along with the Department of Education, will do outreach to potential eligible youth. And they're well positioned to do that because of their connection to youth who are in care and their ability to identify those youth. There are also outreach obligations on the covered institutions. So all the list of all the schools, community colleges, state-affiliated schools, that those institutions would have outreach obligations as well. And as you see in the slide, and if you want to look in more detail in the bill, those outreach obligations are about disseminating information, but also assisting eligible students in verifying their eligibility, which, as we know, and as Debbie mentioned, is so important, because it's one thing to identify a program that you might be eligible for, but it's another thing to kind of complete and verify eligibility, and this will ensure that young people have some assistance in doing that. There's also some outreach requirements that relate to tracking and really having schools look at how best to serve these students, to make sure that we're always looking at how there can be improvement and more assistance provided to students. Next slide. And then the next provision, which again we think is just a really excellent policy to implement, is requiring that all the covered schools have single points of contact. And many of you on the call are probably aware of the idea of a single point of contact, either in terms of maybe your work with homeless students, but single points of contact are designated staff people at institutions who have expertise in working with a certain population, but also have expertise in understanding what's available for them on campus and in the community. So in terms of how we address some of the barriers and challenges that Debbie mentioned, I think the single points of contact is such a great way to do this, because you would have someone on campus who is able to understand some of the challenges youth in foster care might face, but is also able to respond, help them connect with what's available. And I think another theme of this bill is that we want to add opportunities and benefits for young people, but we also want to make sure we help them connect to and leverage existing resources. And single points of contact are great at doing that, because we do want to make sure that one of the barriers that Debbie mentioned is addressed, that even we know a lot of youth are eligible for existing financial aid and many don't connect with it or don't complete the applications to do it. So we really do want to, in this effort, and I think, again, the bill does a good job of this, of saying we want to make sure everything we have out there that's available for young people, that they're using that. And what's great about having these people be on campus is that they are going to be aware of what campus support programs exist for all students and how young people in foster care might be able to tap into those, as well as what's available in their own community. If a young person in Philadelphia goes to school in the middle of the state, they're going to know less about what's in that community, but the single point of contact should, and that will be really helpful in building that safety net. Next slide. And then there are some reporting and tracking requirements. And again, we've listed exactly what they are on the slide, but the goal is really to make sure that schools are tracking the students that they're serving, with the goal of really trying to figure out how the program is working and how to improve it. We always have challenges with both identifying students and then making sure, we are troubleshooting when there are problems, either with individual students or with implementation, to make sure that, one, students are getting the support they need, but two, that the program is operating in a way that really does maximally benefit all young people. So I think these requirements and these provisions of the bill are really important, because they speak to hopefully the efforts to continuously improve these programs so they provide the support for young people. Next slide.
Great. Thank you so much. So, Deborah, as you mentioned, there was an informational meeting yesterday in Harrisburg on House Bill 1745 that both Deborah and Jenny were there. So what were some of the discussions that took place during that meeting, and what are the next steps for the bill?
Okay, thanks, Nadia. So there were a number of people who were invited to testify before. This was an informational hearing for the House Education Committee. So committee members could learn more, ask questions, hear from stakeholders in terms of their support, lack of support, any questions or concerns they had, to really look to bring forward the best bill and help them understand whether they're going to support this piece of legislation or not. So it was presented in 4 panels. The first was looking at the perspective of youth in foster care and resource families. So Jenny Bekempner testified very much what she just spoke to regarding providing, from a non-stakeholder, providing factual information to provide history, provide context, provide need, data. They also heard from a foster parent and from a former foster youth, it's actually a woman who's now 30, who was not able to go through college, and talk about her experience as well in that panel. The second panel were stakeholders who would, under this legislation, be required to provide tuition and fee waivers, and as well as the support services and data collection. So it was important to hear stakeholders' perspective. So a president of one of the community colleges spoke on behalf of the Commission for Community Colleges. In other words, what this body that is a kind of a membership organization, as it were, of the community colleges across the Commonwealth spoke to that. Someone from Temple University, who has launched one of the first campus-based support programs in Pennsylvania, and would be impacted by this. And then the president, I believe, of the Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology. So all of them were very supportive of this legislation, very encouraging. And to me, what was really critical is that these were all institutions who would have to absorb the financial burden, but despite that, still felt this was an important piece of legislation. The next was FIA, as folks may know it, the Pennsylvania Higher Education Assistance Agency, which administers financial aid to students across the Commonwealth, and spoke about their role and their support of this as well. And lastly was the National Conference of State Legislatures, which is a national nonpartisan body that really monitors and reports on legislative trends and needs and data from across the country. And they spoke very much in support of this legislation as something that is receiving national attention, and the work that and what is recommended addresses attention. One of the issues that we have raised through the legislation and our work, it's not just important to get young people to college, but to help them be successful and actually complete and earn a degree. So we're encouraged that components addressing both parts are in this legislation as well. Next slide. So what did we hear yesterday? First of all, it was a standing room only session, which was very, very encouraging to us, that we thought that this piece of legislation really resonated with a number of folks. In addition to legislators asking questions, there was even one of the co-sponsors who came and asked permission to ask questions and speak in support of the legislation, despite her not having technical standing for this. So that really, was very, very encouraging that there was real interest and support in this issue. There were a couple of questions that came up that would require looking at some fine-tuning of the language in terms of just, clarifying further eligibility, clarifying a little more on the single point of contact. One university felt their read of this was that one person at the university had to be knowledgeable about financial aid and about housing and about academic advising, and felt that would be too much, when in fact the design of the single point of contact is to have someone identified in all of those departments that they can help walk a student through. So maybe needs to be a little clarification around that. So no one objected strongly to any of the components of it. It was more questions of clarification. The president of Luzerne Community College, who spoke on behalf of their association, talked about how they're actually doing outreach to youth in foster care, and so they're looking for more ways to support youth, and this really supports the work they're already doing. And Thaddeus Stevens similarly said they have been, supporting and helping. This is the work that they have been doing, and they're very pleased with the success of young people in foster care who've attended their program. One of the things also we talked about is that the majority of states right now, over half the states in the country, do have tuition waivers or scholarships for youth in foster care. And so Pennsylvania is, Pennsylvania typically is not on the leading edge of anything. We're not innovative as a state or legislatively. But, here this has been done. Tried and done other places, and most of our surrounding states, in fact, have a similar program. One of the things that we did clarify, that was a question that's come up again, is that this is only for young people who have been involved in substitute care through Pennsylvania. So if we have someone who's been in foster care in New York and moves to Pennsylvania, they would not be eligible. So it's only Pennsylvania youth. And that was a point of clarification. So if that's a question that any of you have or come up in any of the conversations, that was very clear. We also talked about, some of the provisions were that a young person has to be in placement for a minimum of 30 days. And we've been helping stakeholders to understand that a parent can't place their kid in foster care for the purposes of getting free tuition. That's not how kids come into foster care. So there really isn't a mechanism for abuse of this. It's very clear. And, we who work in the child welfare system, often speak in shorthand. And these are things that we take for granted. But, when you think about people who really don't know, have no reason to know the foster care system, they're going to have questions about things that seem very obvious to us, but, are very clear. One person, we had a question from, one person on a conversation who thought, all of these people of means are going to be adopting these kids out of foster care and looking as a way to avoid paying for their college. Jenny actually clarified that the independent status has nothing to do with permanency outcomes, but that someone who's been in foster care by federal law over the age of 13 remains independent for the purposes of that. But the reality is we do not have wealthy people adopting all of our kids out of the foster care system. That's a fallacy. This isn't Daddy Warbucks. This is not, what we're talking about. So, but I think it really points out the importance of folks who don't have exposure to the child welfare system, and honestly, people in the education committee typically don't. So, just helping them to really kind of have an understanding of who kids are and what's happening. So, one of the things, again, that was really striking to me was schools testifying in strong support of this bill despite the financial impact that they would have. So that was important. So in terms of next steps, what will be happening next steps is that they will be looking to tweak or amend some of the language and provisions based on feedback that they heard from people. The other thing is that, it always comes up, who's going to pay for this? This was written it was written with the understanding that there would be no legislative stream of funding. There would be no appropriation for this. And that the cost of tuition waivers and the cost of fee waivers and the cost of designating staff as single points of contact and the cost of collecting data would be borne by the institutions, borne by the colleges themselves. But there's a formality they need to go through, which is having an appropriations markup to look at the bill and to make a determination whether there is a financial cost to the legislature or not. And that's one other step that will need to happen. So Nadia, on to you.
Great. Thank you so much. So that was really helpful overview of the types of barriers that young people face and how this bill is really taking some very strong measures to address a variety of those barriers. And as Deborah just mentioned, there will be a few additional legislative drafting processes that now happen, but as those go on, we really want to get people excited about this and showing their support to the legislature about this bill and what a great what a great support it will be for young people in Pennsylvania. So just really quickly, I'm going to go through a variety of different advocacy opportunities that the Juvenile Law Center and the Field Center are participating in, and that we really invite you all to join in as well. And as Jenny mentioned earlier, we will be providing copies of this PowerPoint, and that will be really helpful in light of the next few slides that will have a lot of links that you can access at a later time. So the first set of advocacy opportunities is that the Juvenile Law Center and the Field Center have put together a letter of support that we are asking for sign-ons to show your support, and the letter essentially outlines a lot of the topics that we've talked about today, a lot of the barriers that young people face, and how the bill provisions will specifically work to address those barriers. And so the link on the screen when you have the PowerPoint will take you to a Google form that allows you to just very easily sign on and show your support and encourage lawmakers to move forward with this bill. Second, in terms of social media, every Tuesday we use the hashtag Fostering Higher Ed to promote, to share stories of young people, to share statistics around this issue of young people with experience in the foster care system accessing higher education. And so please retweet our tweets. Use our hashtag to share your own stories and statistics and experiences, and that will really build a lot of support around this bill and around this topic of higher education success for youth with experience in the foster care system. We're also happy to work with you or your organization or students that you work with to write op-eds. And if you click the link when you have the PowerPoint, you'll have an example of that. But these can be really helpful in providing additional viewpoints on how this bill will affect your community or a young person you work with, or yourself if you're a student that wants that would benefit from this bill or would have benefited from this bill. And we can work with you to write that op-ed, help get it placed. So if there's any interest in that, please let us know, and our contact information will be on the last slide, and we'd love to work with you on that. There's also opportunities to call members of the Education Committee and ask them to vote HB1745 out of committee so it continues to progress along its legislative process. And so this link will take you to the list of members to find their contact information. And we're asking for two particular call-in days specifically, Thursday, May 24th, which is tomorrow, and Thursday, May 31st. And these call-in days specifically, you can call in otherwise, but these call-in days really will help build momentum around this issue. So, so we're asking us to all kind of join together in making these calls and asking legislators to support the bill. And just to give you like a brief script of what you can speak about when you call, we've provided that here, but essentially it just expresses the support for HB1745, the Fostering Independence Through Education Act, and asking that the members vote the bill out of the Education Committee so it can be considered by the House as a whole, and showing support for young people in the foster care system and the fact that they should have an opportunity for higher education success. And when you're making these calls, of course, if there's any personal experiences or important information that you want to add to show how the bill can make positive change for young people, it of course is highly encouraged that you share that information so these legislators and people can really understand the impact of this bill and how it's going to create some really positive change in the state. And just very quickly in the next two slides, I'll put up the names of the education committee members and the districts that they come from. So especially if you live or work or attend school in these districts, they can be people that you are willing to contact or encouraged to contact. So here are the Republican members and then the Democratic members of the education committee. Also, in addition to the members of the education committee, you can also call your representative and ask them to co-sponsor the bill. So as we discussed before, there's already a pretty, there's already many co-sponsors, but there's always important to get more co-sponsors. And you can also offer to meet with your representatives, especially if you can engage youth who would be impacted by the bill. And if you're interested in this kind of outreach, we can help you prepare and help you, kind of talk through what that meeting would look like and what type of information to emphasize. And in preparation for either any of these phone calls or these meetings or any other advocacy that you're interested in doing around this issue, we've prepared several fact sheets that are available on our website. And the fact sheets address what the barriers are, similar to what we discussed earlier in today's presentation, but also going into more details about what the barriers are that young people face and how the bill will help resolve some of these barriers, and then additional information. For example, the What Works fact sheet talks through some of the success that other states have had in programs, similar programs, or when they've offered single points of contact, and information about what's working in other states that can all be a resource as you prepare for this advocacy. And on our website, you'll also find Juvenile Law Center's testimony from yesterday and the text of the bill if you want more information on it.
And Nadia, can I just add, for all of you on the phone who might be involved with some activities related to Foster Care Month, the call-in days are great activities that you can do in groups. So we just did want to remind you, again, I know all you know this, but we did try to schedule those call-in days still in May. So if you have groups together, it's always a fun thing to make those calls together. You can support each other. Again, even in making those calls, Nadia provided like a draft script. We're happy to talk with you more if it's something you're interested in doing as a end of the Foster Care Month activity.
Great. And I just put up our contact information there. So if there's if you would like our help or you would like access to more resources, please just give us a call or shoot us an email, and we're happy to, answer further questions. So it looks like we have about 4 more minutes. So there's one question that came in through the box, but if there's any other questions right now, feel free to type them in. But the question that came in, which is I think we addressed this, but maybe just it'll be helpful to reiterate, at what age do kids need to be adopted or placed by to still be eligible?
So Nadia, right now, the bill's language is pretty broad. And the way it's reading right now is it wouldn't have an age limit. And so we do think that that's a portion of the bill that eligibility likely will be fine-tuned. So we want you all to, keep up with us as we do this advocacy efforts, and also weigh in on, what you think eligibility should look like. I mean, all of us on the phone want it to be as broad as possible, and that's what we aim for. But currently, as the bill's written, it is very broad, and doesn't really have an age limit in terms of adoption. It really just is connected to being in substitute care for a certain period of time. But the definition of substitute care speaks to an adjudication of dependency. So keep in touch with us so we can kind of keep everyone abreast of any changes that are made in the drafting process.
Great, thank you. And Jenny, I think you just answered this. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add one thing to that. One of the things, comments yesterday, was that it seemed pretty clear that people did not want to inhibit permanency planning for any young person in order to be eligible to receive this tuition assistance. So that's an important provision to make sure that we don't want to keep a child in foster care status versus adoption just so that they will be able to be eligible.
Great. All right, we'll just end with one last question. And Jenny, I think you just answered this with your clarification about adjudication, but the question asks, can you clarify if this bill will cover youth who have been raised by grandparents without the formal process of foster care?
As it's currently written, no. It needs an adjudication of dependency and placement in substitute care.
Great. All right. There's one more question that came in. Is there any talk of what will happen if the child receives a waiver and then drops out?
So we do, in terms of the way the bill is written, there are similar requirements as there are for financial aid about maintaining progress. And I do think that there will have to be some policies worked out because the tuition waiver is a little different than some of the grants that young people have, that if they don't withdraw appropriately, they might end up having to pay some amount of money back. So I think we don't have an exact clear answer on that, and that's not specifically written into the legislation. I think the hope is that if you combine a lot of these provisions that have to do with the single point of contact and providing assistance in terms of tracking, that ideally we would catch a young person before that happens. But I do think those are some of the kind of implementation but really good questions to ask, because we do find even with grants and financial aid, a lot of students and sometimes the adults working with them aren't as clear about, well, what happens with things like this? Will I owe money back? And these are the things we'll have to make sure that students do understand if there are those types of consequences. But we don't really have that level of detail yet. But I think it's a great point to raise as something that we would want to answer and make sure whatever the answer is, students are fully informed so they understand.
Great. And then there's two last questions, and I think they address the same topic, so I'm just going to read the first one. But how long after graduating from high school or obtaining a diploma can a person take advantage of this opportunity? For example, can an adult come back when they're 35 and take advantage of the higher education opportunity?
No. So currently the age range is between 16 and 23 that you could utilize it.
Great.
And I totally understand that for some young people, the ideal would be to have a longer period because it might take longer to pursue and complete higher education. So that might be something that could be fine-tuned. The Chafee Act, the education training vouchers, was just expanded to 26. But currently, the bill has 16 to 23.
Great, thank you.
And there was some testimony yesterday regarding young people who've experienced foster care, often in college later and later. So I wouldn't discount that as a potential option of something that's amended in the bill at some point. I wouldn't count on it, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Great. Thank you so much. We had one last question that asked if this covers room and board, and the answer, unfortunately, is no. It is just specifically towards tuition and fees. So that brings us to the end of our time. So thank you very much for participating and bearing with us, especially as we had some technical difficulties at the end. But the slide with our contact information is still available, is still up on the screen. So if there's any additional questions or any comments, or you would like help with any of the advocacy opportunities that we discussed, please let us know, and we'll be happy to
Nadia, can I add one parting word? So these are really great questions, and this is one of the reasons we really encourage you both to contact us three as well as your representatives, because there will be fine-tuning of this bill, and we really want to be able to say that the community has given input, and if your experience really does support, like helps us argue for a larger window, or can give us any other, provisions or experiences you face that really should be taken into account. As Debbie said, we can't guarantee that we can cut that into the bill, but it really helps to hear from the communities and stakeholders who would be impacted by this, of what really you're experiencing and what really would help us. And it really does help with our advocacy. So we thank you for these comments. We will totally try to take them into account as we do our advocacy, but really would like to enlist you all in our advocacy efforts.